A man accidentally discovered a hungry, cold, and injured dog wandering on the street. But what he did next really made the dog. Winter in the city was unforgiving, especially for those with nowhere to go. Amidst the biting wind and the distant hum of traffic, a lone figure curled up in the shadows of a narrow alley behind the marketplace. His fur, once thick and beautiful, was now matted with dirt, his ribs pressing painfully against his skin. Shadow, as he was once called, had not always been a stray. There was a time when he had a home, a family, a warm bed to curl up in, and a hand to pat his head, but that life was gone now. One day his owners packed their things and left. Shadow waited by the door, expecting them to return. Hours turned into days, days into weeks, but no one came back for him. At first he lingered near the apartment building, his once bright blue eyes scanning every passing face, hoping to see the familiar figures he had once trusted, but hunger gnawed at his belly and the cold nights bit into his bones. The scent of food lured him away from his waiting spot, deeper into the city, into the unknown. The streets were unkind. The other strays in the area did not welcome newcomers. They were hungry too, and they fought fiercely for every scrap of food. Shadow's body bore the marks of these encounters, old scars mixed with fresh wounds, painful reminders of battles lost. And then there were the humans. Some ignored him completely, while others chased him away with sticks and stones. He had once approached a young woman outside a cafe, his tail wagging ever so slightly, but she recoiled in disgust and shooed him away as if he were filth. After that, Shadow stopped trying. He became a ghost, a shadow of his former self, slipping through the alleys, avoiding eye contact, always ready to run. The only thing that kept him moving was instinct, the primal need to survive, to find the next meal, to make it through another day. But tonight his body had reached its limit. He had not eaten in days, and the bitter wind had stolen the last traces of warmth from his frail frame. His legs buckled beneath him, and he collapsed onto the damp pavement. The world around him blurred. The neon lights from distant storefronts flickered in his fading vision. The sounds of the city faded into nothingness. He closed his eyes, too exhausted to move, too weak to care. This was it, wasn't it? The end. For the first time since he had been abandoned, Shadow did not fight. He simply let go. Daniel had seen many cases of abandonment and neglect in his years as an animal rescuer, but something about this particular dog made his chest tighten. The way its ribs jutted out under the thin, filthy coat, the way its eyes, though barely open, reflected nothing but exhaustion and mistrust. It was the look of a soul that had already given up. He knelt down a few feet away, careful not to startle the dog. Experience had taught him that animals in such dire states were often as wary as they were weak. His fingers instinctively reached for his bag, pulling out a packet of soft food. "Hey, buddy," he murmured, his voice gentle, barely more than a whisper. "I won't hurt you." The dog did not move. For a moment, Daniel feared he was already too late, but then he saw a faint twitch of the creature's ear, a sign of life. Encouraged, he unwrapped the food and placed it on the ground between them before shifting back, giving the dog space. He knew better than to force contact. Trust wasn't something you could rush. Minutes passed. The dog remained still. Daniel didn't move either. It was a battle of patience, and he had plenty to spare. The night deepened. The distant hum of traffic faded as the city settled into its late-hour stillness. Daniel sat cross-legged, arms resting on his knees, watching the dog with quiet determination. Then finally, movement. A slight, hesitant turn of the head, a sniff of the air. The dog's body remained limp, but its nose twitched, scenting the food only inches away. Come on, Daniel thought, you can do it. Another few minutes, another small movement. Then, with a struggle that made Daniel's heart clench, the dog weakly lifted its head. Its eyes flicked toward him, wary, guarded, but hunger won over fear. It dragged itself forward, inch by painful inch, until its nose touched the food. It hesitated, as if still doubting whether it was safe, then finally began to eat, slow and cautious. Daniel exhaled, only now realizing he had been holding his breath. He didn't speak, didn't move. He simply watched as the dog devoured the meal, its frail body trembling with the effort. It wasn't much, but it was a start. When the food was gone, the dog collapsed again, as if the simple act of eating had drained the last of its strength. Daniel knew he couldn't leave him here. Slowly, carefully, he reached into his bag and pulled out a blanket. The dog stiffened, its breathing quickening slightly, but it was too weak to flee. "It's okay," Daniel whispered, draping the blanket over its shivering frame. The dog flinched, but didn't resist. That was a good sign. Now came the hardest part, getting him out of here. Daniel glanced at his car parked just down the street. He could carry him, but forcing contact too soon might make things worse. The dog needed to feel like he had a choice. So Daniel did what he did best. He waited. An hour passed. The dog, too weak to fight, remained where he was. Every now and then his eyes fluttered open, watching Daniel with cautious suspicion, but he didn't move. Another hour. Finally, Daniel knew he couldn't delay any longer. He moved slowly, shifting closer, inch by inch. The dog's muscles tensed, but he didn't growl. Another small victory. Gently, Daniel placed a hand on the dog's side, feeling the rapid, shallow breaths beneath his palm. "It's all right, buddy," he murmured. Then, with practiced care, he lifted him. The dog was lighter than he should have been, frighteningly so. He barely struggled as Daniel cradled him against his chest, stepping carefully toward the car. As he opened the passenger door, he felt a faint tremor go through the dog's body. Fear, no doubt. He was used to being abandoned, not rescued. Daniel placed him on the seat, keeping the blanket wrapped around him. He left the door open for a moment, giving him an out, a choice. The dog didn't move. Daniel nodded as if some silent agreement had been reached. He climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. As the car rumbled to life, he glanced at his passenger. The dog's eyes remained open, but exhaustion was taking over. "It's going to be okay," Daniel promised. The dog didn't respond, but for the first time, he didn't flinch either. The drive back to the rescue center was silent, except for the steady hum of the engine. Daniel kept glancing at the dog beside him, watching for any signs of distress. The animal lay curled up under the blanket, motionless except for the faint rise and fall of his ribs. He had seen many abandoned dogs before, but there was something different about this one. He wasn't just malnourished, he was broken. His body remained tense, even in exhaustion, his eyes never fully closing, always on edge. It was the kind of suffering that didn't just come from hunger, but from something deeper. As they pulled into the dimly lit driveway of the rescue center, Daniel turned off the engine and exhaled slowly. "All right, buddy," he murmured. "Let's get you inside." The dog didn't react. Gently, Daniel reached over and lifted the frail body once again. The dog stiffened, his muscles tightening under the touch, but he didn't resist. That in itself was a small victory. Inside, the center was quiet. Most of the other rescues were asleep in their kennels, their soft breathing filling the space. Daniel carried the dog through the hallway, past rows of cages, until he reached an empty, private enclosure in the back. He set the dog down onto a thick, warm blanket. A fresh bowl of water and some softened food were placed nearby. "Here you go," Daniel said softly, stepping back to give him space. The dog barely moved. His eyes flicked toward the food, then back at Daniel, full of suspicion. Daniel sighed. He knew this would take time. "I'll be back in the morning," he promised. As he turned to leave, he hesitated. The dog's eyes were still on him, half-lidded but alert. For a split second, Daniel considered staying, but he knew better. Trust had to be built slowly, so he simply sat outside the kennel for a while, letting the dog know he wasn't alone. Only when exhaustion finally pulled the animal into a restless sleep did he get up and walk away. The night was anything but peaceful. Daniel had barely drifted off in the staff quarters when a sound jolted him awake. A low, terrified whimper echoed through the silent rescue center. Shadow. Daniel was on his feet in seconds, hurrying toward the back kennels. As he neared the dog's enclosure, he saw the source of the noise. Shadow was thrashing in his sleep, legs twitching, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His body shuddered violently, as if caught in the grips of a nightmare. Daniel's heart clenched. Slowly he crouched down outside the kennel. "Hey," he called softly, "you're okay." The dog jerked awake, his body snapping upright. His blue eyes, wide and wild, darted frantically around the room before settling on Daniel. His breathing was harsh, his whole body trembling. Daniel remained still. "It was just a dream," he said gently. "You're safe now." For a long moment the dog didn't move. His chest heaved, every muscle in his body wound tight. Then, little by little, the tension eased. The dog lowered his head slightly, his ears flicking back. Not in submission, just exhaustion. Daniel released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "That's it," he murmured. He stayed there until the dog's breathing evened out again. Only when the animal finally curled up, eyes heavy with exhaustion, did Daniel leave. But as he walked back to his room, one thought stayed with him. This dog had seen things that had left scars deeper than just the ones on his body. And Daniel was determined to heal them. The next few days were slow. Shadow refused to eat while anyone was watching. He barely moved unless necessary. Any loud noise, a door closing, a dropped object, sent him shrinking into the corner, shaking. Daniel never pushed him. Instead, he did what he had learned through years of working with abused animals. He simply existed near him. Every morning, he brought food and water, then sat nearby, reading or working on his laptop, never forcing interaction. At first, Shadow ignored him. Then, slowly, day by day, he began to adjust. A week later, he ate while Daniel was still in the room. 2 weeks later, he took a few cautious steps toward the man who had saved him. A month later, he let Daniel touch him for the first time. It was a slow, painstaking process, but Daniel never lost patience, and little by little, the dog who had once been nothing but a shadow started to become something more. One evening, as Daniel was sitting outside the kennel, typing on his laptop, he felt something nudge his knee. He looked down. Shadow was there, standing hesitantly beside him, his cold nose pressed against Daniel's leg. Daniel stilled. He didn't move, didn't speak. He let Shadow make the next move. The dog's ears twitched. He hesitated. Then carefully, tentatively, lowered himself down beside Daniel, resting his thin body against the man's leg. Daniel exhaled slowly. It wasn't much, but it was the first real sign of trust, and that was enough. The days turned into weeks, and Shadow's progress was slow but steady. His ribs were no longer as prominent, and his once dull fur was starting to regain a faint sheen. The physical wounds healed faster than the emotional ones. Despite Daniel's patience and care, the dog still flinched at sudden movements and refused to approach strangers. One evening, a storm rolled in, the sky darkening as thunder rumbled in the distance. Daniel had seen Shadow's reaction to loud noises before, but tonight was worse. The first crack of thunder sent the dog scrambling to the farthest corner of his enclosure, his entire body trembling violently. His breaths were ragged, his eyes wild with panic. Daniel sat outside the kennel, speaking softly. "It's okay, buddy. You're safe." But Shadow wasn't listening. His mind was somewhere else, trapped in a past Daniel could only guess at. Rain pounded against the roof, the wind howling through the gaps in the windows. Then came another clap of thunder, and Shadow bolted. His claws scraped against the concrete floor as he threw himself against the kennel door, desperate to escape. He didn't understand that there was nowhere to run. Daniel's heart ached at the sight. He knew he had to do something. Ignoring the risk, he carefully unlatched the door and stepped inside. Shadow froze, his entire body still shaking, his eyes darting toward Daniel. "I won't hurt you," Daniel said, crouching low, making himself as non-threatening as possible. "You don't have to be afraid." Shadow panted heavily, muscles tight, ready to flee, but there was nowhere left to go. He had spent so long running. Then something changed. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the warmth in Daniel's voice. Or maybe, for the first time in a long time, Shadow wanted to believe he was safe. Slowly, hesitantly, he took a step forward. Then another. Daniel stayed still, his heart hammering as Shadow crept closer, until finally the dog pressed his head lightly against Daniel's knee. The contact was fleeting, barely a touch, but it was enough. Daniel reached out, cautiously brushing his fingers along the dog's fur. Shadow didn't pull away. "You're okay," Daniel whispered. "You don't have to be afraid anymore." The storm raged on outside, but inside that small kennel, a different battle had been won. For the first time, Shadow had chosen trust over fear. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the world damp and fresh with the scent of rain. The sky was painted in soft hues of gold and blue as sunlight filtered through the rescue center's windows. Daniel stirred awake in the chair he had dozed off in, his back aching slightly from the uncomfortable position. He hadn't meant to fall asleep here, but after last night's breakthrough, he hadn't wanted to leave Shadow alone. His eyes immediately flicked to the kennel, where Shadow lay curled up in a loose ball, his breathing slow and steady. His ears twitched slightly, but he didn't seem as tense as he usually was. The sight made Daniel exhale in relief. Last night had been a breakthrough, one he wasn't sure would ever come. The dog had finally allowed himself to trust, if only for a moment. Daniel stood, stretching out his stiff limbs before stepping toward the kennel door. As if sensing movement, Shadow lifted his head, his blue eyes locking onto Daniel's. For once they weren't filled with fear. There was still caution, but something else lingered there too. Something softer, something that hadn't been there before. "Morning, buddy," Daniel said, crouching down. "How are we feeling today?" Shadow didn't move immediately, but after a brief hesitation, he pushed himself up to a sitting position. He yawned, his sharp teeth flashing for a moment, then shook himself slightly. He didn't cower. He didn't press himself into the corner like before. Daniel smiled. "How about some breakfast?" He moved slowly, retrieving a fresh bowl of food and setting it down inside the kennel. Shadow sniffed the air, but didn't touch it right away. Daniel sat down a few feet away, waiting. It had become their unspoken routine. Minutes passed in silence. The only sounds were the soft breathing of the other animals in the center and the occasional creak of the old building settling. Daniel didn't mind the quiet. He had learned long ago that patience was the key with dogs like Shadow. Then, to Daniel's quiet surprise, Shadow took a step forward. His movements were hesitant, but this time there was no trembling, no desperate glances toward the door. He lowered his head and began to eat while Daniel was still in the room. Daniel felt an unfamiliar pressure in his chest. Hope. "You're really doing it, huh?" he murmured, watching as Shadow took slow, deliberate bites. "I knew you had it in you." After finishing his meal, Shadow licked his lips and looked up at Daniel. And then, to his utter astonishment, the dog took a few tentative steps toward him. Daniel remained completely still, barely daring to breathe. Shadow hesitated, just a foot away, as if debating whether or not to retreat. His muscles tensed, ready to flee if necessary. Daniel knew this was a test, a final leap of faith. The dog's ears flicked back slightly, and then, as if making up his mind, he did something unexpected. He lifted his head and gently nudged Daniel's hand. Daniel blinked, his breath catching slightly. Slowly, carefully, he let his fingers brush over Shadow's fur, feeling the warmth beneath his touch. Shadow didn't flinch. Encouraged, Daniel let his hand linger for a second longer before moving it down to scratch lightly behind Shadow's ear. A place where, he suspected, the dog had once been touched with kindness long ago. Shadow's body stiffened at first, then slowly, almost imperceptibly relaxed under the gentle motion. It wasn't much, but it was something. A single moment of trust in a world that had once shown him nothing but cruelty. "You really are full of surprises, aren't you?" Daniel whispered. The moment lasted only a few seconds before Shadow stepped back, but the impact was profound. It wasn't just about food anymore. It wasn't about survival. It was about trust. Daniel watched as the dog circled once before settling down near him. Not pressed against the farthest wall as before, but closer, just a little closer. He knew better than to push it, so he simply sat with him in silence, feeling the weight of the moment. And in that quiet morning light, for the first time, Shadow was no longer just a lost, broken soul. He was finally finding his way home.